Good morning, everybody. I hope everyone is enjoying their weekend. This week in Equip class, we're going to be covering Genesis chapters 12 through 50. And I want to start off this video by just reading the first few verses of Genesis chapter 12. It says, "Now the Lord said to Abram, 'Go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I will show you. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great. And so you shall be a blessing, and I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you all of the families of the earth will be blessed.' So Abraham went forth as the Lord had spoken to him." Right there in the first 3 or 4 verses of Genesis chapter 12, there are 3 huge themes that are introduced, themes that will carry us not only through the rest of the Old Testament, but carry us through the rest of the Bible. And those 3 themes are covenant, election, and faith. Right there in the opening verses, we see that God has called Abraham. Another word for calling that we use is election. God has elected Abraham. Now, we don't know why God elected Abraham. We can assume that maybe it was Abraham's capacity for faith, that maybe that's the reason why God called him, but we don't know. We have to make an assumption, right? But really, what we see throughout scriptures when it comes to election is that there doesn't seem to be any conditions on it. It is simply God's desire, right? God calls someone because he wants to call someone. God, I'm sure, has his reasons, but he doesn't always reveal those reasons to us. And so that's why whenever we talk about election, oftentimes we'll put that word unconditional election in front of it, right? It is simply God's choice. God will choose who he chooses. So God calls Abraham. God has elected Abraham. What has God elected Abraham for? Well, God has elected Abraham as the person with whom he's going to start his covenant. God has elected Abraham to be in covenant with him. So a covenant would be, kind of similar to a contract. It's got 2 sides to it. On God's side of the covenant, God has made a pretty big promise that people who are in covenant with him will be his people. And there are ways in which the covenant gets more specific than that, but that's the big part of it on God's part, that people who are in covenant with God, they will be his people. Throughout the Old Testament and into the New Testament, we see that God has a chosen people. These are the people that God has elected to be in covenant with, right? And on our end of it, the way that we remain in covenant with God is through faith. Now, in this covenant, in this promise that God is making to Abraham right here at the beginning of Genesis chapter 12, he says that I will make a great nation of you. And so this genetic line from Abraham, appears to be part of the covenant, that God will bless Abraham with, this great genetic line, right? But it's really not primarily about genetics. It really isn't. It is about faith. Even when you speak with Jewish people, yes, there is a genetic element to it. My parents were Jewish, and therefore I am Jewish. But it really is still primarily about faith. If the descendants of Abraham leave their faith behind, well, genetically they are still descendants of Abraham. But if they leave their faith behind, then they are out of covenant with God. Now, here's the thing about God's covenant is that it is really, even when we are faithless, God has shown over and over and over again that he is faithful. And so he will oftentimes go to miraculous means to maintain this covenant. And so the 3 big themes that are introduced right here that are going to be carried out through the rest of Scripture are Covenant, election, and faith. Now, one thing I do want to say is that, as Baptists, whenever we hear these words, especially when it comes to election and faith, oftentimes we can think of these words as primarily having to do with how to get into heaven. And when you read about it in the whole scope of Scripture, that's part of the story of faith and election. It does have something to do with heaven, but overwhelmingly, faith and election are important words for us right here, right now. Because really what the whole scope of the story of Scripture is that faith and election really have more to do with being a part of God's community of faith, being a part of God's chosen people for eternity, but eternity includes right now, and it includes the past, and it includes the future, right? So these words, as long as we are living in right now, are really more important for right now. How do we relate to God? Well, we relate to God through faith. Faith is what gets us into covenant with God. Election is what gets us into covenant with God, right? And so when our mind automatically jumps to heaven, we are skipping over such an important part of the story. And now I want to introduce one more big word, and that word is hope, right? Hope. One of the themes that we will see whenever we hear these words, covenant, election, and faith, is that God has entered into covenant with us so that we can always have hope. And we need hope because God's story is a very long story, at least how we experience it. It is a very long story. It was a long time from the time that God first made his promise to Abraham until God's people occupied the promised land. It was a long time from the time that God's people first occupied the promised land until we got to David. It was a long time from David until God finally sent his Messiah. And it is a long time from the time that God sent his Messiah until we are expecting and waiting for his return, right? And so one of the big reasons God has entered into covenant with us is so that we do not lose our hope. So that we do not lose our hope. Because, and the reason God's covenant gives us hope is because it helps us to know that it is not all up to us, right? It is up to God. God maintains the covenant, and we can have hope that he will continue to maintain the covenant because he has already maintained it for thousands of years. And he's given us sign after sign that he's going to continue to maintain it so that our hope will be fulfilled, right? And that God has elected us to go about the work of being his chosen people on this earth, blessing the nations of the world through us, bringing more and more people into this covenant of faith with God. And yes, it's taking a long time, but we can continue to have hope. And we better not lose that hope, because once we lose hope, the next thing to go is faith. And faith is the thing keeping us in covenant with God on our end, okay? So as we walk through Genesis chapters 12 through 50, just remember covenant, election, faith, and all of that leading to hope.